In March of 2016, a single developer sat down at his computer, typed a short command, and deleted 11 lines of code. He wasn't trying to cause damage, he was making a point. Within hours, websites at some of the largest technology companies on Earth stopped working. Software builds failed by the thousands, every few seconds, all over the world. Engineers at Facebook, at Netflix, at Airbnb, sat staring at broken screens with no idea why. The cause, when they finally found it, was almost impossible to believe. 11 lines of code, a tool so small most programmers had never even looked at it. This is the story of LeftPad, and the day one man's protest nearly broke the internet. To understand how something so small could do so much damage, you have to understand how modern software is actually built. Almost nobody writes a program from scratch anymore. Instead, developers borrow small pieces of code that other people have already written and shared freely, snapping them together like building blocks to save time. Think of it like a kitchen. A chef doesn't grow their own wheat or press their own olive oil. They buy ingredients from suppliers they trust, and they build a meal on top of that foundation. Modern software works the same way. Programmers rely on enormous libraries of free, shared code, written by volunteers, strangers, hobbyists all over the world. For the JavaScript programming language, the language that runs most of the interactive parts of the modern web, that library was called NPM. And by 2016, NPM was enormous. Millions of packages, billions of downloads. It was the pantry that half the internet's kitchens were quietly pulling ingredients from, and that pantry ran on trust almost entirely. Nobody was inspecting every ingredient before it went on the shelf. There was no formal review board checking each new package for safety, for quality, for how many other projects might eventually come to depend on it. Anyone with an internet connection and a free account could publish anything they wanted, instantly, to a registry that developers everywhere would then treat as a trustworthy source. That openness was the entire point. It was what made the ecosystem grow so fast in the first place. But openness and fragility, it turns out, can be two sides of the exact same coin. One of the people stocking that pantry was a young software developer from Turkey named Azer Koçulu. He wrote and published hundreds of small, free packages to NPM over the years, tools other programmers could plug into their own projects instead of writing that code themselves. Most of his packages were tiny, obscure, forgettable. One of them was called LeftPad. It did almost nothing. If you gave it a string of text and told it how long you wanted that text to be, LeftPad would add extra characters, usually spaces or zeros, to the left side until it reached the length you asked for. That's it. That's the whole function. It existed so that other programmers wouldn't have to write those same 11 lines themselves, over and over, in 100 different projects. It was digital duct tape. Nobody thought about it. Nobody was supposed to have to, but here is the twist that makes this story matter. LeftPad wasn't just used directly by a handful of projects. It was buried, often invisibly, inside other packages, which were themselves used inside other packages, which were used inside massive, famous pieces of software. Tools like Babel, which converts modern JavaScript code into a form older web browsers can understand, depended on it. So did tooling connected to React, the framework built by Facebook that powers a huge portion of the interactive websites you use every single day. LeftPad had quietly become what engineers call a dependency, several layers down, of an enormous share of the JavaScript ecosystem. Nobody had gone looking for it. Nobody had audited it. It was just there. The way a single screw holds together a piece of furniture nobody ever thinks to check. And in early 2016, without anyone realizing it, that screw was about to come loose. The trouble didn't start with LeftPad at all. It started with a different, much smaller package that Azer Koçulu had also published, one called Kick. In early March 2016, Koçulu received a message. It wasn't from another developer. It was from a lawyer representing Kick Interactive, the Canadian company behind the popular Kick Messenger app. Kick Interactive wanted the name. They were building their own JavaScript tool and wanted to publish it to NPM under the name Kick, matching their brand. There was just one problem. Koçulu had gotten there first, publishing his own unrelated package under that name, fair and square, under NPM's simple first-come, first-served naming rules. Koçulu refused to hand it over. Why should he? He'd registered the name legitimately. He wasn't infringing on anyone's trademark by using a common word for an unrelated coding tool, and he didn't see why a company with lawyers and resources should get to walk in and take something from an independent developer just because they wanted it. Kick Interactive escalated the dispute directly to NPM, the company that actually runs the registry, the ones with the power to reassign a package name if they chose to. And NPM made its decision. They sided with Kick Interactive. The company got the name. Koçulu did not. For Koçulu, this wasn't just about one package name. It felt like a company with money and legal muscle had used its leverage to take something from him, and that the platform he'd been freely contributing to for years had backed the company over the individual. From NPM's side, the calculation looked different. Trademark disputes were becoming more common as more businesses moved into the open source space, and the company had to decide, case by case, how to handle names that collided with registered brands. But from where Koçulu sat, it looked like a simple transfer of power, away from the volunteer who built something first, and toward the company that wanted it more and could afford to ask for it. He wrote publicly about how disillusioned he felt with NPM, and more broadly, with a culture where open, freely shared code, built by unpaid volunteers, was increasingly being folded into corporate products and corporate interests without much given back in return. And then he made a decision that would ripple across the internet within hours. On March 22, 2016, Azer Koçulu logged into NPM and unpublished every single package he had ever released, 273 of them. Gone, not just Kick, all of them, including one you've already heard about, LeftPad. For a brief moment, nothing happened. It was quiet, and then it wasn't. Software isn't built once and left alone. Every single day, all over the world, computers are constantly reassembling projects from scratch, pulling in all their required pieces fresh, to test them, package them, and deploy them. It's like a restaurant that doesn't keep ingredients in the fridge overnight. Every single morning, it sends someone back out to the same suppliers to restock, because that's simply how the kitchen was designed to run. So when LeftPad vanished from NPM's shelves, it wasn't just gone for people trying to download it for the first time that day. It was gone for every single computer, anywhere in the world, in the middle of assembling a project that needed it. And there were a staggering number of those computers, because LeftPad sat buried inside so many other widely used tools. At NPM's headquarters, engineers watched their monitoring systems light up. Around 2:30 in the afternoon Pacific time, error rates began spiking, hundreds of failures a minute, and climbing. Developers everywhere were typing the same familiar commands they typed every day, commands that had always simply worked, and getting back a wall of red error text instead. Package not found. Build failed. At first, almost nobody understood why. They weren't looking for LeftPad. Most of them had never heard of it. They were trying to build ordinary projects, using ordinary, trusted tools, and those tools were failing for a reason buried so many layers beneath the surface that it was nearly invisible. It would be like your car refusing to start, and the mechanic discovering the actual cause was a single missing washer inside a supplier's factory 3 countries away, one that happened to be used in a part of your engine. Some developers assumed at first that their own code was broken. They dug through their recent changes, looking for a mistake they had personally made, because that was the far more familiar explanation. Others assumed NPM servers themselves were simply down, a routine outage, the kind that happens now and then and usually resolves itself within the hour. Almost nobody guessed the real answer on the first try, because the real answer didn't make intuitive sense. A tool that pads text with spaces does not sound like something that could take down a chunk of the modern internet. It sounds like something too small to matter at all. That mismatch between how trivial the tool seemed and how catastrophic its absence turned out to be was exactly what made the outage so disorienting while it was happening. As word spread through developer forums and chat rooms that afternoon, the scale of it became clear. This wasn't one company's problem. It was everyone's problem all at once. Estimates at the time suggested roughly 1/3 to nearly half of all JavaScript projects being built that day were affected in some way, whether directly or through some tangled chain of dependencies. Engineering teams at Facebook, at Netflix, at Airbnb, at companies whose names you'd recognize instantly and thousands more you wouldn't. All of them independently, staring at the same baffling error, tracing it back through layer after layer of software they hadn't written and had never had reason to inspect, until they arrived at the same tiny, absurd answer. 11 lines. Gone. Here is where the story takes its sharpest turn and its most human one, because the fix, in the most literal sense, took almost no time at all. Within about 10 minutes of left pad disappearing, another developer, a programmer named Cameron Westland, who had nothing to do with the original dispute, simply rewrote the same basic function and published it to NPM under a nearly identical name, so that projects pointing to that name could resolve again. It was a patch, not a real solution, and it didn't fix everything, because countless projects were still explicitly pointing at the exact original package that no longer existed. But it was a sign of just how simple, how almost embarrassingly trivial, the actual code at the center of this global outage really was. The problem wasn't the complexity of the code. The problem was how much invisible weight had been quietly stacked on top of something nobody had ever bothered to question. The real resolution came from NPM itself. Laurie Voss, the company's chief technology officer at the time, made a decision that broke with how the platform normally operated. Ordinarily, when a developer removes their own code, NPM treats that as their right. It's their package. Under everyday circumstances, the company doesn't overrule that choice. But this wasn't an everyday circumstance. This was a huge, ongoing, worldwide outage, growing worse by the minute, and the source of it was sitting right there, technically capable of being restored. So NPM did something it had never really done before. Without Koçulu's involvement, the company reached in and republished left pad, the actual original version, back onto the registry, exactly as it had existed before. Some engineers, only half joking, called it the un-unpublishing. Once the original package reappeared, the wave of build failures across the world began to recede almost as quickly as it had risen. Within hours of the first outage, most of the damage had already been undone. But something had been exposed that couldn't simply be patched back into place. The incident forced a very uncomfortable question out into the open, one that had been sitting quietly underneath the entire structure of modern software for years. How much of the internet was being held up by tiny pieces of code that almost nobody had ever inspected, maintained by volunteers working for free, with no formal responsibility to anyone, and no warning system if they ever decided to walk away. It wasn't a hypothetical anymore. It had just happened in front of everyone in a single afternoon. A lone developer, acting entirely within his rights over a dispute that had nothing to do with LeftPad at all, had shown that a huge share of the world's software infrastructure rested on a foundation nobody had ever stress-tested. Nobody had designed the JavaScript ecosystem to work this way. Exactly. It had simply grown that way, one convenient shortcut at a time, until an enormous, invisible structure had been built on a foundation nobody thought to check twice. It's worth pausing on just how strange that solution actually was, from a philosophical standpoint. The entire culture of open-source software runs on the idea that creators retain control over what they make and give away. If NPM could simply reach in and restore a package against its author's wishes once, during an emergency, then the platform was quietly admitting something uncomfortable, that certain pieces of code had become so deeply load-bearing that they weren't fully private property anymore, not in any practical sense. They belonged, functionally, to everyone who now depended on them, whether the original author had agreed to that arrangement or not. That is not a comfortable position for any company to be in, and it is not a comfortable position for any individual developer to be in either. There's a term software engineers sometimes use for this kind of risk. They call it a single point of failure, a place in a system where, if just one small thing breaks, everything built on top of it comes down with it. Bridges are engineered to avoid this. So are airplanes and power grids and hospital backup generators. But nobody had engineered the software supply chain that way, because nobody had really thought of it as a supply chain at all. It felt more like borrowing a cup of sugar from a neighbor. Except in this case, it turned out that half the neighborhood was quietly borrowing sugar from the exact same house, and nobody had ever stopped to ask what would happen if that house simply closed its door. In the aftermath, NPM made changes meant to prevent something like this from happening again. The company introduced new rules limiting when and how a developer could unpublish a package once other projects had come to depend on it. Under the new policy, once enough time had passed and other people's code relied on yours, you could no longer simply erase it on a whim, the way Koçulu had been able to with LeftPad. It wasn't a perfect fix. Critics pointed out fairly that it also took away some of the freedom and control that had made open-source communities feel genuinely open in the first place. The same freedom Koçulu had been trying to exercise, however disruptively, when the whole episode began. But it reflected a hard truth the incident had made impossible to ignore. When enough other people are quietly depending on your code, walking away from it isn't purely a private decision anymore, no matter how justified your reasons might feel. As for Azer Koçulu, he never framed himself as some kind of digital saboteur. He made a protest over what he saw as an unfair decision by NPM, favoring a company's trademark over an individual developer's legitimate, first-come claim, and he hadn't set out to break Babel or React's tooling or the build pipelines of half the tech industry. He simply hadn't realized, and arguably almost nobody had realized, just how many places a tiny piece of code like LeftPad had ended up living. That, in the end, is really what makes this story land. It isn't a story about a villain. It's a story about how invisible and tangled modern software had quietly become, without a single person ever deciding on purpose that it should work that way. LeftPad itself was restored within hours, and for the vast majority of people affected that day, the whole episode became little more than a strange blip, a confusing hour or two of broken builds before everything quietly went back to normal. But inside the software industry, it never really faded. It became a story engineers still tell each other, years later, whenever the conversation turns to open source risk, to dependency chains, to the strange fragility hiding underneath systems that look, from the outside, unshakably solid. It's referenced in university courses on software engineering. It comes up in security conferences, in discussions about supply chain attacks, in arguments about how much trust we quietly place in code we've never read, written by people we've never met, sitting somewhere in a dependency tree we've never bothered to open. Left pad became shorthand for a much bigger idea, that scale and complexity can hide enormous risk in the smallest, most forgettable places, and that nobody notices the load-bearing wall until the day it's gone. What makes the story worth remembering isn't really the size of the outage, even though the outage was real, and it was massive, touching an enormous share of the software the world builds on every single day. It's the size of the cause. 11 lines, a function almost any programmer could rewrite from memory in under a minute. Removed not out of malice, not as an attack, but as a personal protest over a naming dispute that, on its own, barely mattered to anyone outside of it. And that gap, between the almost comical smallness of the cause and the staggering scale of the consequence, is exactly what the entire incident revealed about the world we'd already built for ourselves, usually without noticing. Somewhere beneath nearly every app on your phone, every website you load, every piece of software quietly running in the background of your life, there are thousands of tiny, invisible decisions like left pad, decisions nobody double-checks, written by people nobody thinks to think, holding far more weight than anyone ever intended them to carry. Most of the time, that's fine. Most of the time, nobody ever has to find out. But for one afternoon in March of 2016, the entire internet found out exactly how much of itself was, resting on 11 lines of code, and on the goodwill of a stranger who had never agreed to hold it up forever.